This is Qt 5 Design Patterns Section 11. This section deals with the Qt State Machine Framework. We're going to talk about what is state and how to use QState. We're going to talk about the state machine itself, along with a final state and groups of states. And we're going to talk about history within states, how to go back and forth. And we're going to talk about how to navigate within a group of states. And to wrap it all up, we're going to talk about state within widget applications and state within QML applications. Let's talk about the state machine framework. Now, disclaimer alert, this is a massive topic. There's no way we can cover everything, but we're going to cover enough so that you know how to use it and you can get moving in your own projects. I've actually thought about creating an entire course just on the state machine framework. If you read the official Qt documentation, it gets a little bit confusing. For example, the state machine framework provides classes for creating and executing state graphs. Okay, well this just intro sentence here gives me more questions than answers. What is state? Why do I need a framework for state? What are the classes? What are state graphs? Why do I need to execute state graphs? And on and on and on. So you can dig through their documentation and you're going to get a lot of things that seem very confusing until you get to this. What does this really signify? You have some entry point and then S1, S2, S3, and you can see there's some interaction. Button click, button click, button click. So what we have are three distinct states, and there's some sort of transition between each state that is triggered by some user interaction, a button clicked. So let's dial it down just a notch for this video and say, what is state? It's great that we have this state machine and this great framework, but what is state? Well, for the term state inside of Qt and the state machine framework, state is simply put the values of variables within an object. And when I say object, that could be a class, a set of classes, or the entire application. Now, we're going to dial it back even further, and you can have groups of states. So here you have S1, S11, 12, and 13. So S1 is a state, and it has states within it. This is the Qt parent-child relationship. Don't get confused. And it can get even more complex. You can have histories, and so you can go back and forth from one state to another state, or one group of states to another group of states. It gets very ugly very, very quickly. And when you dive outside of Qt looking for some sort of terminology, you're going to see the term state sprinkled across just about every language and every framework out there, and each one has a slightly different definition. For example, you can have a communication state, a data state, a control state, session state. You can have application state, resource state. This gets super, super complex. So let's just crack open a very simple application. Let's go new. I'm going to create a class. And let's just look at this from a newbie perspective of what, simply put, is state. So we have a class. Inside of here, we're just going to make a variable. You've done this billions and billions of times, I hope. Nothing super exciting about this. We can even right click, add getters and setters. But what are we really doing here? Well, we're creating a class which will be usable, and now we have some internal value. This value becomes part of the object state, because that value can change. Now, a constant is also part of the state, but we're really not going to have that conversation. We're worried about things that are going to change. Now, because that value inside of this class can change, this class is also part of state. Now, what do we mean by this? When we talk about state, we're talking about a very vague term here. So this would be, and I'm going to put in parentheses, the application state. And this would be part of the class state. So you can see now you have different levels. So when you talk about state, you're talking about very, very vague terms. And this is where it gets kind of confusing very quickly. For example, if we just set this, we're talking about the initial class state. It's initial because it's what we're setting it in the constructor, and it gets very formal, and you're going to get a lot of people that are going to say, oh wait, it's not this, it's that, and blah blah blah. And really what it boils down to is if something can change, it's part of a state. Oh, looks like I forgot an include here. We'll go ahead and fix that. Got a little copy and paste happy there. And let's go ahead and auto indent that, just make it pretty. So really what we're talking about here is we have an initial state, we are returning the state, and then we're setting the state. Now notice how I'm not saying variable, even though that's under the hood what we're really doing. So getting state, setting state, things of that nature. Now, this is where things get a little bit different. When we go into QtLand, notice there's a QState class. And if we go into QState, QState provides a general purpose state for the state machine. So think of this kind of like the Q object for the state machine. And it has a fairly lengthy description, but you can add transitions, remove transitions, and things like that. So really what QState does is it interacts with the objects we're going to create. Very, very easy to use, very simple, but you've got to wrap your head around it a little bit. So to wrap up this video, I'm just going to say include our little bulb class here. And I'm going to say bulb. Bulb is now part of the application state because it's running, you guessed it, on main, so it's part of the application. And then we can actually say bulb dot set powered, and let's set it to true. And then bulb set powered. Let's go ahead and turn it back off. Now notice how I'm putting state changed. What does this really mean? So if we were to serialize this class down to like a file on the disk and it was powered on, that's one state. If it was powered off, that's another state. So for the purpose of this video, let's overly simplify things when we talk about the Qt state machine framework, and we're just focused on what is the word state. Is just simply the variables inside of your containers, those containers being your application or your class or whatever you want, but it's just simply those values. So let's just dive headfirst into the Qt state machine framework and let's see this thing in action. So I have a very, very simple widgets application here. Let's just crack this open. It's just got a line edit and a button inside of a vertical layout. Does really nothing if you look at it. So we just have the on push button click already wired up. So let's save and run. If I go to our application output, bring this up, you can see this is really all it does. Absolutely nothing to this application. Wanted to start as bare bones as we can. First thing we need to do, you guessed it, is we got some includes. So I'm going to say Q state machine. Let's go ahead and include our Q state. From here, I'm going to go into slots and I want void state entered because I want to know when we actually enter a state. And void state exited. Now let's take a brief pause and let's go over to the state machine framework documentation. Here we go. So this is really what we're going to do. We're going to have 3 separate states and we want to be able to navigate those states or transition between them based on a button click. We're going to use one button, 3 states. So we want to know when those states are entered and when we exit. And it's pretty easy to track. So when the buttons click, we are entering from state 1 to state 2, and we are exiting state 1, and then on and on and on. Pretty self-explanatory, and we're just making a circular pattern here. Let's go ahead and implement these. And I want to actually put QInfo. I want to know which exact state it was. Say sender. So we've got state entered, so we can know exactly which state we entered and exited. Notice how we're calling sender, which basically is going to give us, you guessed it, the sender or the object that emitted the signal. So all of this is signals and slots under the hood. That takes a lot of the complexity right out of it. It's just the baked-in technology that you know and love. From here, let's go ahead and make a QState machine. And let's call this state machine, the ever descriptive variable name. And now I want 3 states. Let's call this state 1. And through the magic of copy and paste, we can just make 2 others very rapidly. So now we have state 2 and state 3. So this is the state machine, and these are the individual states. And I'm just going to put some notes in here real quick. Now you notice how we're not really defining individual values. What we're going to do next is we're going to flip into, you guessed it, our little dialog here, and we're going to set this thing up. So the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to set some object names. So I know what we're doing when we're in QInfo land here. Because I set object name, let's call this state 1. And copy and paste land. So I'm just going to say, let's go ahead and do state 2 and state 3. Now let's go ahead and connect our signals and slots. So what we're going to do here is we're going to connect our states to these slots right here. So I'm going to do connect state 1. Let's go ahead and go QState. And I want to know when it entered. And then this. State entered. Very, very simple, very easy to understand. The signals and slots, things we've worked with billions of times. And then I want to know the exited to state exited. Kind of annoying the IDE does that, and we can just grab this and do the same for each state. All right, so we've got state 1, entered exit, state 2, entered exit, state 3, entered exit. Whew, lots of entering and exiting. Now let's go ahead and add a note here. I'm going to say connect the states to slots. So just so we know what's going on. Now we're going to change those properties of the states. This one takes a little bit of explaining, but I'm going to try and make it super, super simple. The state is going to hold some sort of internal property. So we're going to say M state 1, and we want to assign a property. Notice how it wants a pointer to a Q object, some sort of name, and then a Q variant, some sort of value. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say UI line edit is our object. And then we are going to set the text property of that line edit to in state 1. So really what we're doing here, if you remember our conversations about Q property, what we're basically doing is saying UI line edit set text. But under the hood, they have a Q property called text, and that's what we're really calling here. So let's go ahead and grab this. And you guessed it, bang, bang. Let's go ahead and do 2 and 3. So there's 2, there's 3, and now I want to set some transitions. Now before we move on though, the assign property, when we enter a state, so let's say for example we enter state 2, it's going to fire off this property change. So it's going to say state 2, what do I have for the assigned property? Oh, I have this line edits text is going to say in state 2. Now I want to be able to add the transitions. What we're going to do is add the transitions, but what does it really mean when we add a transition? Think of it like step-by-step directions. I'm going to say mstate1 add transition. I almost wish they called this add step. We're going to say UI push button. That's our object, and we want to know what signal is going to be emitted here. So I'm going to say Q push button clicked, and then you guessed it, we're going to move over to state 2. So when the UI push button is clicked, we're going to move to state 2. And then we're going to just do the same thing. Move to state 3. And let's make state 3 transition over to state 1. So really we're just forming a giant loop. Very simple to understand once you really wrap your head around their terminology. You have to connect the signals and slots, assign properties you're going to change, add the transitions, but we're not done yet. We need to add them to the machine. So I'm going to say mState machine, and we're going to add state, and we're going to add state 1, and then we're going to go ahead and add 2 and 3. You may be asking yourself, what is the point of all this? This seems rather complex to do really silly things. Well, you're about to witness something awesome here. So let's go mState machine. We want to set the initial state, and we're going to say M1, or I'm sorry, mState1. That tells the machine what to start with, and then we're going to start that machine up. This blew me away the first time I saw it. So we have basically connected all these signals and slots, and we've added some transitions. Let's go ahead and fire this up and see what it does. We're in state 1, and as I click this button, state 2, state 3, back to state 1. So now we can very easily control what happens when we click this button, and we can do it through the state machine. You may be asking yourself, why bother? Well, I'm going to just say it. For C++ applications and even, well, widget applications, it may not on the surface be abundantly helpful, but when you get into more complex UIs, this is amazing. And when you get into QML, this is the way to go. Let's take a look at the QFinal state. What we're going to do is create a non-looping state, meaning something that has a beginning and something that has an end. Our last example, we had this nice loop, and it just kept going and going. We're going to take this arrow out of here. So we're going to have about 10 states, and then something called a QFinal state. You may be asking yourself, why do you need a QFinal state? Well, that's a very good question. If you dive into the documentation, it gets a little bit confusing, and they point you right back to QState. And it says the signal is emitted when a final child state has entered, meaning it points you right back to QFinal state, and it just goes back and forth, and you're trying to figure out what really the difference here is. Really what you need to understand is that when QFinal state is entered, it emits a special signal letting the state machine framework know we are now done, stop running. That's really all it does. Super confusing the way they did that, and you notice how the QFinal state inherits QAbstract state, not QState. Ugh, frustrating. All right. Same interface as last time, but now we're going to do a linear state instead of a looping state. We are going to, just to save a bit of time, do some copy and paste action on some of the more simple code. QDialog, QState machine, QState, QDebug, QFinal state, QAbstract state, and message box. So the premise here being, when we run this, we're going to click this, and it's going to go through all the states and display them here. And when we're done, it's going to say complete, disable this button, and pop open a message box so that we know beyond the shadow of a doubt we are done with our state machine. So we're going to have some slots, and then I'm going to have in some private stuff here. So I'm going to have the QState machine. I'm going to have a QList of QAbstract states called states, and a function called addState. So let's right click, and I want a special note here, kind of doing this the hard way just to really illustrate what's going on, and I'm going to try to explain the hard and the easy way. So first things first, we need to actually create some states. To do that, we want our little add state. So I'm going to go in here, right click, and let's go add definition. Add state, its sole purpose for being is, you guessed it, we are going to add some states to that queue list. So just some boilerplate code, nothing super complicated. It looks like a big old wad of code. Let's walk through it. We're just going to say add a state. We're going to assign a property, and whenever you see the assign property, think we are changing something. So we're going to change the line edits text to whatever the state's object name is. So it's going to be like state 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, blah, blah, blah. And then I is the state's length. If we're greater than 0, meaning we're not the first state on the list, then we want to add a transition. Because we're going to have a starting point, the 0 index, we want to transition to the next and the next and the next. Then we just simply have our state entered, state exit, and state finished. Notice we're doing this on the QState, not the QFinal state. When this transitions from the last QState in this list to the QFinal state, this QState is going to, you guessed it, emit the state finished. Whew. States append, and then state machine add state. Some of the stuff I'm just kind of like mind boggled here on how all of this works, because you got to really kind of fish through the documentation to really figure it out. Let's go back up to our constructor here. And here is where we're going to just add in some boilerplate nonsense. Bang. So 0 to 10, I increment, we're going to create a state, we're going to set that object name, and we're going to call that add state, which just literally does all the connections, adds it to our state machine and our list. Special note here, states are actually children. This is what I mean by hard way and easy way. The easy way would just be the mStateMachine.children, but I really wanted to separate the two so you understand what's going on under the hood here. You really don't need this queue list. You very easily could put this into the mStateMachine.children, and it does actually do it automatically. So for example, we can say, bang, the states are added as children. Let's test that out. Save, run. And we have 10 children. So all those states are nice and neat right in there. Let's go down to our dialog. Whoops, got the wrong one. There's our deconstructor for our dialog here, and all we're doing is doing our memory management. If we just backboned off the state machine children, we really wouldn't need to do this. Again, I'm just holding it out there so you can see what's going on under the hood. And let's go ahead and add our final state. And this is where I'm going to slow down just a little bit. So I'm going to say Q final state. And this is going to be new Q final state. Again, billions of different ways we can manage that memory if we really felt like it. I'm going to say Q state. And let's call this P for pointer. And let's go ahead and say QObjectCast. And we're just going to grab the last state out of that list here. And I'm going to say again, could have used the state machine children. All right, now what we're going to do is we're going to add a transition. So we're going to say P, add transition. Remember, when we talk about a transition, we're talking about moving from one state to the next. So I'm going to say UI push button, and we're going to monitor that Q push button clicked. And we're going to move this over to the final or the QFinal state, which is going to kick off that state machine has now finished. So what I'm going to do is, you guessed it, we're going to go ahead and we're going to say connect the mState machine, and we want the QState machine's finish signal. Notice how we're monitoring the state machine, not the QFinal state. And let's go ahead and say state finished. This is where it gets super confusing. It's hard to keep track of what's actually going on here. So when the QFinal state is entered, it's going to emit a signal that the state machine has connected to. The state machine then turns around and it emits its own finish signal. Super confusing the way it does that. All right, so let's go mState machine, and let's go ahead and add our state final. Again, because it is just got the children, it's just a queue list of pointers to queue objects, so it doesn't really matter. We could have put a checkbox or whatever we wanted in there. And that's why I really didn't use the children. In case somebody tries to add something in, you will very easily break your application. And then state machine, set the initial state, and we're going to say mStates at 0. So our first state is going to be our initial state. Shocking, I know. And then let's go ahead and go state machine. Let's go ahead and start this thing up. We need like some sound effect, like a chainsaw starting up or something. All right, almost done. We just need to know what exactly is going on here. I wanted to make special note of this right here. This on push button clicked is really our trigger for everything going on. If we don't have this in, like if this didn't exist, and we got this by going into the UI, right click, go to slot, and clicked. If we didn't do that, there is a high chance that this will never fire off because it just simply does not exist and it's just never emitted. It's one of those weird little gotchas with widgets. So if you're trying to do this on your own and you're not downloading the code from GitHub and you skip that step, it'll just never fire off. All right, now I've got state entered, state exited, bang bang, entered, exit. Very simple. When our state finished is fired off, and I could have said state machine finished, that way it was a little clearer. We're going to say QInfo, whatever the sender, finished, and then we're going to set the text of the line edit to complete, set the push button enable defaults, and then display a message box to the user, because you know how users are. They can get a little fickle and you got to tell them 30 or 40 times. Save and run. Let's check this out. State 0 is our initial state, and we're just going to blast through these here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and bang! State machine is finished. Everything works as expected. So if we dive in here, we can see how the signals and slots worked under the hood. We have just kind of started off with 10 children, and then bang, 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 we've done all our entries and exits from our various states, and then the state machine emits the finished signal. Very confusing the way they did that. Just understand that if you want a linear state or some sort of final state, you need to use the QFinal state class, but you don't monitor this class, you monitor the QState machine. Let's take a look at groups of states, and this gets a little complex until you really just think of it in terms of the parent-child relationship. So if I go to the QState machine documentation, you can see you can have a state and then have substates in it. And this is just the normal cute parent-child relationship that you would think of. Now the problem here comes in when you look at QState. Let's go up here and go to more. And you can see how this really has a child mode property, and you can set the initial state and all that. But when we look at the QState object itself, you'll see the constructor is a little bit different. We cannot set this as a Q object. This has to be a Q state. Oh, that gets frustrating really fast. So you're going to see me do a couple little weird things, and I'll try to explain why as I go. But I just wanted to point out right from the very beginning is that you have to set a parent to either null pointer or a Q state. You can't set a Q object. All right, our interface is going to be very, very simple. We're going to have 3 groups, and when I say groups, think of the group as just a state. So state 1, state 2, state 3, whoops, save run. Let's make that a little clearer. So state 1 will be here, state 2 here, and state 3 here. It'll progress as we click. So each state is going to have substates. So like step 1 may have 5 or 50 steps, state 2, 5 or 1,000, and so on and so on. The point I'm getting at here is if we look at the documentation and go back, you can have groups of states. So a state can contain other states, which really makes it a group. And under the hood, this is just the cute parent-child relationship. You can kind of see the interaction here. They're creating a state with a parent-child relationship. Very simple once you actually wrap your head around it, but at first you kind of look at it like, what? All right. Very simple code to start off with. It's just our dialog. We've got that on push button clicked in there. We've got to have that in there, or you guessed it, the state machine will never see that signal emitted from the button. Switch to our source. There's absolutely nothing in there. So we're pretty much starting with a blank canvas. I am going to whip through this fairly quickly, or at least try to. Q dialog, Q state machine, Q state, Q debug, Q final state, Q abstract state, message box, and line edit. We are going to, you guessed it, have some slots. We're going to have state entered and state finished. And then we're going to have some private stuff here. So I'm going to grab this and say state machine, our states. We're going to create group, which is where we're going to create a state and all of the substates in it. So we're going to name that group and then have a number or a count of substates and link that into the editor of our choosing. Then we're going to connect the states. This is just going to connect up signals and slots, create the transitions from one state to another, and then create our final state. Seems like a lot of work. All right, let's go in here and just start implementing these. This is kind of the boring part here. I've thought about fast forwarding or just transitioning past this, but I've had a lot of complaints in the past when I do that where people are like, nope, we want to see every single individual step, no matter how mundane it is. I had one guy, he just couldn't wrap his head around how the function magically appeared because I had paused a video. So I had to stop and explain to him, okay, video editing 101. In hindsight, I see how it would have been confusing. All right, so we have all of our functions here. What we need to do is look at this from a high-level overview. First thing we're going to do is create the group. So we're going to say create group, and let's call this group 1. And let's say we want group 1 to have 5 children, and we want that to hook into the UI line edit 1. And then through the magic copy and paste, we can just grab him. And we're going to create groups 2 and 3. Group 2, group 3. Each one of them going to have 5, and then we're going to link group 2 to, you guessed it, line edit 2. Group 3 is going to go to line edit 3. Could have done that much differently, but I just wanted to keep it super, super simple. Now that we have our groups, we're going to transition from one group to another. So I'm going to say create transitions. And then we want to be able to track when we're done. So we're going to create our final state. And then, of course, state machine, set the initial state. And I'm going to set this to our list at 0. Again, we could have used that eternal parent-child relationship. I just felt like putting everything in a queue list so it was nice and easy for the beginners to understand. Feel free to make it more complex if you really want to. And then we're going to go ahead and start. Because we're going to be doing some memory management, we're going to say Q delete all. We're going to clear out our list, and then we're going to say mstates clear. Don't really need to do that, but just because. All right, so this is the high-level overview. We're going to create our groups, create the transitions, create the final, and then start the state machine up. So let's just dive right into create group. Where are you at? Right here. This is going to be arguably the most complex code about this whole application, and it's really not that complex. So I'm going to say qstate, and actually let's call this parent. And we are not going to give this a parent. That's why I'm doing that memory management in the deconstructor. And connect state, we're going to connect this. Connect state is just the function right here below us. We're going to connect the parent to the editor. And the editor is just the QLine edit pointer right here that we're getting. Very easily could have just put that right here rather than breaking it off into a separate function, but I just wanted to keep it a little bit clean. Now that we have that, we're going to say parent, set the object name, and we're going to set this to the name given to us in our parameters. Let's go ahead and add this to our state machine. We're going to add state. So that's it for the top level. Now what we need to do is actually go in and add the substates, and this is where the code's going to get a little nuts. When I say a little nuts, it's actually not that bad. So I'm going to say previous, and we want this to be null pointer, and we're going to say for int I equals 0, I is less than the count. Let's go ahead and create some child states here. So I'm going to say qstate. I'm going to say qstate, and here we're going to actually set the parent. And it's just a pointer to that initial state right here. So really, if you look at this, what we have here is, you guessed it, a state, and then we are connecting the state, setting the object name, adding it to the state machine, so we've got some top level items here. And then we're going to add that to our list. We could very easily move that up here if we felt like it, but I'm just going to keep it down at the bottom, so reading it becomes painfully obvious what's going on. So we're configuring our parent state, adding in children, and then adding it to our high-level list here. All right, so let's go ahead and finish out these children here. Now I'm going to say if I is 0, so if we're the first one, then I'm going to say the parent set initial state to this state. So really all we're doing, we're saying, is if we are the first child of this state or this group, then this is the initial state we want it to be. And then state, we're going to go ahead and set object name, and we're going to say name plus, and this is where I really start going, what do I want to do here? I get kind of lost for what I want to do sometimes. Say string, and let's go ahead and add in the number just so we can see what's going on here. So it's just going to show the name of the parent group and then whatever step we're actually on. And then we're going to call connect state, which is the function we haven't yet filled out, which is just going to be, you guessed it, the state and the editor. So every child of that parent is going to use the same editor. And now we want to say if there is a previous, we want to add a transition from the previous to this one. So we want to be able to progress or move through those states. I want to say previous, and we got to actually grab previous somewhere. So let's go ahead and do that real quick before I forget. Otherwise, I will completely forget, and then we're going to spend 10 minutes trying to figure out what I did wrong here. So I'm going to say add transition. I want to do UI, push button, and that push button's clicked is what we're going to be monitoring. So we're going to say Q push button clicked. There we go. And this is going to hook into the current state that we're talking about, or should say the substate of this parent. Seems super state of the art, not really. So really, recap, we're just making some high level parent states. Each parent state is going to have its own substates, however many we choose, and these states are just going to be named whatever the group name is and the number. And then we're just appending the high-level parent up to our states list here. All right, we survived that, so let's move along here. So let's look at connect state. This is dead simple. I'm not even going to waste your time. just going to say bang. We're connecting signals and slots. So we're connecting the state, entered, exit, and finished to our dialog state entered, state exit, state finished, and we're saying state assign property. Hit the brakes real fast. Whenever you see assign, we're changing something. So we're calling a Q property under the hood, and we're saying the editor, the Q line edits text property, or UI blah 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 dot set text to whatever the state's object name. Very, very simple code. Now we're going to go ahead and create our transitions here. All right, let's create transition. This is where we're going to move from one state to the other. So I'm going to say Q state previous equal null pointer. This should look very, very familiar from what we basically just did. And you would be absolutely right. It's pretty much, I'm going to just bang. Cheap knockoff of this code up here that we've already written. We're going to loop through all of the states in our list. These are the parent states, mind you. And we're going to say, get that state at that position. And if there's a previous, add the transition from the previous to the current. So the 0 will always have a transition to 1, 1 to 2, and so on and so on. But the very last state will not transition to anything else. Now, create final. This is, remember from our conversation, we have to have a Q final state. And this is what annoys me to no end about this. I wish it would just automatically detect this is the last state in our internal child list and then do something from there. But alas, that's not how that works. So we're going to say Q state previous, and I want to say mstates.last. So we want to get the last parent state. Now we want a Q final state. Probably should have picked a better variable name, but final equal new Q final state. Let's get some screen real estate here so we can see what we're doing. So we've got our previous state is going to be the last state. And then the Q final state is just going to be a new Q final state. We're going to say previous, add transition, and this is where we're going to transition based on the button click to the final state. So I'm going to say UI push button, and then we want the Q push button clicked signal. And this is going to transition to the final state. And remember, the final state, or the Q final state, if you will, this is what really tells the state machine, hey, we are done. So the state machine then will emit a signal. And I absolutely hate doing connect code, but let's do it anyways. So we're going to say connect. I don't know why I hate doing connect code. It's super simple. It's way simpler than it was, but it's still just kind of boring. So we're going to say hook into the state machine finish. I shouldn't say hook. We're going to connect to the state machine finished. And we're going to connect to this slot in this object, dialog state finished. So we're going to get instant feedback when that state machine is actually done. And then of course we're going to say m state machine. We're going to add the final state here. Not super hard to understand. Like I said, there's a lot of what I call drudgery where the code is like not hard but not simple. And I'm going to just completely speed this up. So I'm going to say state entered, state exit, state finished. I'm going to, just from our last example. Okay, so we're saying sender is null, then return, but then we've got an entered, exit, and then finish, and then we're going to pop open a dialog box. We could very easily also disable that button or do any other thing that we really wanted to do. Speaking of button here, this is something that I've noticed, and I don't know if this is a bug or as intended. If we do not fill this, like if we left this blank, we're going to have a problem. That signal's actually never emitted, so you need to put something here. And like I said, I don't know if that's intentionally designed into the way this works, because we're using the IDE to automatically create that signal and slot for us, or if it's just something screwy like the compiler's taking it out because there's nothing to do, or I don't know, to be brutally honest with you. But we need to put something here so this actually fires off. oops, Q info, and we're just going to say clicked, and let's go state machine dot is running. Nothing super high tech there. All right, let's make sure we've got everything in here. Sure looks like it. Let's give it a good build. Make sure we didn't goof anything up or miss anything. No warnings, no errors. All right, quick recap before we run. We're going to create 3 parent groups. Each group is going to have its own line edit that it's going to play around with. We create the transitions, we create the final state, and then we set the initial state, and then we start. Very, very easily could have just not gone with a queue list and instead used the state machine's children, their internal list. All right, so we are in group 1, step 0, and we can just step through these. You can see group 1, 3, 4, bang. Now we're in group 2, step 0, and it will just keep going. And when we're done, we're done. And we could disable this button. If we keep clicking it, nothing happens because we have hit that queue final state. Let's do that again. Group 1, step 0, I'm just going to plow through these. You can see how it automatically jumps through. That is extremely cool. So now you can have groups that are containers for other states, and now you can transition from one group to the next. So when you think about this in software design terms, you can really say, okay, think of like an installation program. Step 1, gather the user information. So that could be our group 1. Step 2 would be install the actual files, and step 3 would be clean up and finish. You can do some really powerful things once you really get this down. And once you get through what I call the code drudgery or the plumbing of just connecting all these things in, it's extremely simple to work with. Let's talk about navigating states. So far, we've only moved forward. Now we're going to be able to move forward and backwards. And this is actually pretty straightforward, but I'm going to start from ground zero. So we've got absolutely nothing in here. If you're taking this course, it's just assumed you know how to do this, but I want to do it just in case somebody out there is kind of scratching, figuring out what's going on here. So we're going to just plop a couple buttons down. Let's call this back. I never know what to name these. Let's call this BTN back. Next. Let's call this BTN next. And let's go ahead and add those in like so. Now we've got our layout all beautified. Pretty basic layout. The premise here is we're going to have a group of states, and we're going to be able to move forward and backwards, and we can edit the name of that state. Let's see how this works. So first things first, let's right click our little line edit here and go to text change, or I'm sorry, text edited. And then we're going to go to the clicked on the back button. And then clicked on the next button. And I'm just going to grab some includes here. We're going to have QDebug, QStateMachine, QState. Let's kind of simplify this a bit. Just make it look nice and pretty. All right, so we've got some additional slots we want to add, the entered, exited, and finished. And then I've got some private stuff we need to plop in here. We're going to, whoa, don't need that. We're going to have the QStateMachine, the root, and the current state, and we're going to create some states here. In case you're wondering what I deleted, is the QHistory state, which is something we're going to cover later on. Maybe. I don't know if we really even need it, but basically it allows you to pick an arbitrary state in time and go back to it. I'm showing you the dead simple way of doing this, where you can just basically go forward and backwards. All right. In a sense, we're almost making our own QHistory state. So we have line edit, clicked, clicked, entered, exit, finished, create states. Let's flip around and see what we got here. All we really have to do at this point is just fill this in. It's kind of like filling in the blank. It's pretty simple. So we're going to go ahead and create states. And then we're going to say state machine start. Now our entered, we're going to go down here and we're just going to say grab some stuff here. Bang. Enter's a little special. We want to actually get the current state. So we're going to say m current, because we want to be able to edit this, so we need an actual pointer to it. So I'm going to say q object cast. All right, very, very simple how that works. And then we're going to just say exited, finished. So let's jump back up to entered. We got this mCurrent. What do we really need this for? Well, when we modify the line edit, we want to actually modify, you guessed it, the current state in the background here. So we're going to go right here. We're going to say should always have an mCurrent, but just in case, we want to just get out of here if there's one. All right, now that we got this, I'm going to say qinfo arg1, and then we're just going to say mCurrent, set the object name to whatever arg1 is. Again, arg1 is just the text of the line edit. Now, if you ever run into this little problem here where the UI, or I should say the UI and the IDE have not synced up, you can see how UI dot, there's no buttons or line edit anything. You can just simply comment this out, save it, give it a good build, uncomment it, and voila, magically it's right back. Or I should say it has appeared like magic. Now we're just going to call the text. This is calling the Q property under the hood in that class, which essentially calls the set text. And I'll say mCurrent. And we're going to say object name. So really all we're doing here is we're saying, as the user types, make sure we have a current object. If we have a current object, set the name to whatever they've typed, and then go ahead and change the line edit to the object name here. Very, very cool, very easy to do. All right, what have we missed so far? We missed the back button, the next button, and our create state. So let's tackle this down at the simplest level. You may even be wondering why these are needed. So when you see on underscore something something, this is Qt's naming convention for their auto connect. In our signals and slot sections, we actually built an auto connection class, and I built it for this very reason right here. I do not trust these, and here's why. If you leave it exactly the way it is now, something on not every operating system, but on certain operating systems, will strip this out and pretend like the signal's never even emitted, and you'll sit there and scratch your head going, now wait a minute, I put this in the code, but when you run it, it just doesn't even emit. So you have to put something in here. Super, super frustrating. Rather than fighting with it, trying to figure out why it's not firing off, you just put something in here and then it's pretty much guaranteed to fire every single time. All right. Now the only thing we're really missing is this create states, and this is, as you could have guessed, where the bulk of the work's going to be. So let's go here. I'm going to go Q state, previous. It's going to be a null pointer. I always forget to set the previous, so I got to remember to do that. Then we're going to go int I equals 0. I is less than anybody, random number 5. And we can set that to pretty much whatever we want. So let's go ahead and go previous before I forget equals, and then we need something. So what we're going to do here is say Q state and we're going to set this to a child of our root. Now, in case you forgot what root was, let's set this really quick before I forget. Flip back to our header here. Remember, root is just our Q state. This is going to act as our group container for all of our little child states here. And you notice how we're not using QList, so we are actually not getting in the way of the parent-child relationship or trying to track it internally like we've done in the previous videos. All right. So what we're doing here is we're creating a bunch of states, and we're going to have to do something with those states here. So I'm going to go ahead and say state. We're going to set the object name. And then whatever I is, really nothing fancy. And then we're going to say if I is 0, pay special attention because we're going to cover this really quick, so don't zone out if you're starting to. I know I start to zone out on some of this plumbing code. All right, so we're going to set the initial state to whatever the state is. So what we're really doing here is we're saying the root set the state. So the group's first state will be state. Now let's jump here before we get too far ahead of ourselves here. And we're going to say m state machine. We're going to add that state. So we're going to add the root. Now we're going to say m state machine set the initial state to the root. There we go. So really the state machine is going to come in here and say, all right, our initial state is this group of states, and the group of states initial state is the first one. So it's really going to go from nothing to root to the first one. Special note on that, because some people are going to get confused and go, well, why isn't it running the root state? Well, it's just kind of using the root state as a container. All right, in here, we can do some plumbing code. Let's go ahead and I'm going to copy it. So we're just doing some signal and slot connections. So we're just connecting our entered, exited, and finished to the state entered, state exited, state finished. And then you guessed it, we're going to say state assign property. Remember, whenever you see a sign, think of the word change. So we're going to change the line edits text to whatever the object name is. So assign property UI line edit text to state object name. Whew. All right, lots of talking. Now we're going to say if there is a previous, then we need to add our transitions. Remember, transitions are how you go forward and backwards here. Now, when we get into our conversation about Q history state, that's really what's happening under the hood, is the Q history states is holding pointers to other states and allows us to jump back to them. So in our case, we're going to say state, we're going to add a transition, and then we're going to say UI, we want the BTM back, and we want to know the Q push button clicked. So when the user clicks that button, we want to be able to go to the previous state. And then the next button is just the polar opposite of that, where we move forward in the child list. So we're going to say the state, we're going to add a transition to the previous, and the previous will add a transition to the state. It allows us to go forward and backwards. And guess what? That's it. It's not super hard. Once you really wrap your head around this, it's super easy to figure out. So we're starting at state 0, and we can say next, state 2, 3, and then we just hit a wall. It can't go any further because there's nothing there. We don't get any index out of range or anything like that. And we could say things like cats, wow, cats, if I could spell it, dogs, fish, birds, and so on and so on. And we can go forward, backwards as we need to. And let's say I need another state here. Pizza, because pizza's an animal, right? I don't know. I ran out of things to talk about. So point being, recap here, you can have states in a group. You can move forward and backwards through those states and modify those state properties. In case you're wondering how you connect your classes to these states, do not fall into the trap of actually inheriting QState. Instead, treat QState much in the way we treat QThread, where you'll use this and then attach your signals and slots to it using the methods we've shown. In this case, the assign properties. So you would say state assign properties, and that's when you'd have to play around with the Qt property system, which we previously covered. Now, this seems very cumbersome when you're in C++ land, but when you get into QML, this is absolutely beautiful. It's baked right into QML. So far, we have completely ignored QML, but fear not, the state machine actually goes right into QML. It's actually baked into QML. It's actually pretty cool. So let's go in here. We're going to go application Qt Quick. We're just going to make a blank one here. Let's call this Qt5 design patterns. This is 11.6. And we're going to just blast through all those. Going to plop some notes in here just in case you download this from GitHub so we know what we're doing. So what are we talking about? State machine and QML? Yes, QML. Because QML has the state machine built right in, and they've got some very rudimentary examples, but this is actually really cool inside of QML. First things first, let's go ahead and let's jump into the designer. We may need to maneuver things around here. We're going to import our controls. Now from here, what we're going to do is we're just going to plop in a button and a label. We're not going to get like super crazy with layouts or anything like that. I mean, we can if we really, really, really want to. But we're just going to drop that in there. And I'm going to just scale this out here. Now you see the states. You may be inclined to just click this button. And if you do, bad things are going to happen. You're going to get this invalid property main states M16. That's very frustrating. So I almost wish if this was the main window, they would hide this because it's really not that usable. It's really designed for component states, not for your application state. Although you can do it, it's going to just start freaking out and you got to go into the code. Anyways, jumping back to where we were, we're going to take a label, drag and drop, and then a button. Drag and drop. Let's go ahead and zoom in here, see what we got. And I like it so far, but we're going to scale this down just a bit. Let's put 25 for spacing, and let's scale this up. And then we're just going to play around with the layouts just a little bit here. Center that thing nice and neat. Very, very cool. Then all I'm going to do is say click me. Probably can't read that. Let me zoom in here. In case you're wondering how I'm zooming, it's just control and then middle mouse zooms in and out. Going to put null for the initial string there. Zoom out and let's jump over here. All right, so far everything is nice and neat. Let's run it, see what this looks like. Sure enough, as expected, just as null, it says click me, does absolutely nothing because we haven't done our signals and slots yet. All right, jumping in here, what we need to do is actually import. So we've got our Qt Quick, Qt Windows, and Qt Controls. Now we need the import Qt QML state machine. Say that 5 times real fast. 1.0 as DSM. So we're just going to import this as a variable named DSM. From there, it becomes ridiculously simple. All we're going to do is we're going to go in here, give this an ID. Let's call this the ever descriptive state machine. And now we're going to create some states. So I'm going to go right here. I'm going to say DSM state. And in case you're wondering, yes, we are pretty much doing what the editor was trying to do, but it said error M16. I'm going to say ID state 1, on entered. That's right, it has the on entered, on exited, and all that stuff. It's very, very simple. And then we'll say label, and we're going to say text equals state 1. Now we're going to go a DSM, and we want a signal transition. Our target state is going to be state 2, which we have not yet created. And the signal is going to be the button clicked. Seems pretty straightforward, and it is. You just have to do it the QML way. Now that we have this nice, neat little state, we can just grab this, and let's just make a few more. So let's call this state 2. This is going to transition to state 3. The signal is going to be button clicked. If you've been paying attention in the previous videos, this is very, very rudimentary. We are just creating our circular state diagram that we did in the very first video. So we have state 1, state 2, state 3, and they just go from state 1 to state 2, state 2 to state 3, state 3 to state 1, and it just keeps looping back and forth. Notice how we have done absolutely nothing with the label to the button. Everything exists in the state machine itself, and that's it. We don't have to play around with it. We don't have to do anything else. It automatically starts it. It knows based off the positioning what the initial state was, or does it? Let's find out. Save and run. No, it does not. So that's one of the caveats. You're going to find some documentation out there that says you don't need the initial state. My specific version, you do. So initial state, state 1. I've seen examples out on the internet where they do not include this, and then in the videos they showed it was running just fine. I actually turn everything on, just like we did with C++, and there's state 1. Now if we click that, nothing happens. Why not here? Because we're calling functions. We want to call the signal. Now it works as expected. And let's bump that font up just because I feel like it. I want it to be a little bit bigger here. So I'm going to go here. And let's say font point size. Let's go ahead and set that something big. And then font dot bold. Let's go ahead and set that to true. Very simple, very easy to use once you get into the QML mindset of doing things here. All right, quick overview of what we've done. We imported the state machine. We added the state machine as DSM, and then we set the ID, set the initial state, set running. Again, some of the documentation I've seen out there omits this altogether, and it still runs. I'm not sure if that's just an older version or if they had some voodoo magic in the background. And then we have our individual states. In the individual states, we're saying on entered, and then we're going to do something here. So there's our property assignment. And then we have a transition, and it's called a signal transition in QML. We're going to say our target is state 2. So we're going to go from state 1 to state 2 using the button clicked signal. Pretty simple once you wrap your head around it. Okay, let's take a deeper look at QML and the state machine. So I'm going to go new, and we're going to make a traffic light. It's going to be a very, very simple traffic light, but a traffic light nonetheless. So the traffic light is just going to have, you guessed it, 2 lights, a red and a green. And let's call this 11-7. We're going to build this whole thing from the ground up just so you can see what's involved. I'm just going to real quickly whip through all those. All right, so absolutely nothing in this thing. Save and run. It's just a complete blank application, blank canvas for us to work with. We're going to right click, we're going to add new, and we're going to make a component. So I'm going to go Qt, QML file, Qt Quick 2. Let's call this light. Next, finish. And the light is going to be the individual light bulb. And this thing sits inside of our traffic light. So we can open the designer And this is where things get a little weird. Let me zoom out. Remember, it's just control middle mouse to zoom in or zoom out, and it gets a little touchy. This is one thing I don't like about the IDE is it gets so finicky. And Windows and Mac, you seem pretty safe, but Linux variants, sometimes playing around with some of these little things could really make your app crash, or make the whole, I should say, make the whole IDE crash, and then you got to figure out what's going on. So all of the weirdness aside, let's go ahead and play around with this. So first things first, we're going to create some properties, and we can do this either via code or via the editor. And I'm going to do a mix and match just so you can see some of these things, but it's just assumed you already know these things. So here is our item in all of its glory. Let's go ahead and give this a name here. Let's call this element. And then our properties, we're going to go down here and let's call this color on. Let's call this color off. And this is going to be a color and a color. And we can scroll over here. And sometimes this gets a little bit weird. So I'm going to say red. And this is going to be black. I'm going to click save and I'm going to flip over to text view just to make sure it did not betray us. You notice how it put the hex code in there instead of black. So already it's starting to play these little games with us here. Nonetheless, let's go ahead and do that. Now let's add a rectangle in here. So we're going to drag this rectangle. We're just going to drag and drop right onto our element. Bang, there it is. And we're going to, you guessed it, set that to take the entire parent. Now what we need to do is set the radius here. So if we look at radius, it's 0. Radius determines kind of like the corners, or I should say the corner edges here. And it's a little hard to see, so let's just set this to a color here. So if we grab this, go down to radius, and let's say a radius of 50. You can see those little things. Say, you can see how those corners start having a radius here. So I'm going to get rid of that. I'm going to do what's called a binding. So we're going to click this, set binding, and we're going to set this to just the width. And it should make its best attempt at a circle. And we can, scale this and all this stuff. I'm not going to do it because once the IDE is weird, so if I were to grab this and move it around, it's going to add a bunch of code, which will screw us up later. This is kind of like the Microsoft Word of the Linux world. I really hate to say that, but it's like you touch one thing and like you end up missing 5 pages and the stock market crashes and all sorts of craziness happens. So I'm going to click this. You notice how it says base state. So this little guy that we've had problems with in the past is now suddenly working. This is what state's really designed for. It's, well, you guessed it, our base state, our starting point basically. So I'm going to set this to like a weird blue. I don't even know what to call that. Now, special note, if we flip over to our main, go to design, and we just click, we're going to get this invalid property name states, M16. That is kind of a bug in the editor here. It should say something more like, hey, please use this in components or add states manually. We're going to flip back to our light, go to the designer. So our base state is the default state. This is the state that the component starts off with as soon as it's created. We're going to create a few more states. So I'm going to say state 1, and let's name this to on. And I can click this guy, and I could change its properties and colors as I see fit. I could even say, you know what, I want to do something like set a binding. So let's say here, let's call this color on. And it automatically knows what to look for. And let's do another one. Again, this gets a little cluttered, I apologize. Off. And let's make sure we have off selected. Make sure we have our rectangle selected. And then let's go ahead and set a binding here. This is the confusing bit. You see that color right there. Doesn't change. That gets super, super confusing. All right, so make sure the rectangle is the ID. We'll go down to the color. And we're going to set that binding. And let's call this color off. Move that here so you can see what I'm doing. Bang. All right. Very simple, very easy to use. And if we wanted to, we could actually flip in here and we could say gray, dark gray, green, brown, blue, whatever we want, and it automatically changes down here. Just to see it again in case you weren't paying attention. You see how it changes? I'll change it here. So this actually becomes extremely powerful, but some things you should note right off the bat is it's an attempt at what you see is what you get. So you have a base state and then whatever states you design. And it holds those in this nice little array here. And I'm going to flip over to full code view so you can see what it just did. We have our item, which is our element, which has our two properties that we created, our rectangle, and then our states array, which has an array of states. And each state has a name, and I don't know why it put it in there like that, and some property changes. And this would be, you guessed it, your assignments. This is very similar to what's going on under the hood in C++ land, where we're going to say, hey, you know what, when this state is entered, take this rectangle, set it to color on. When this state's entered, take this rectangle, set it to color off. Very, very simple the way that works. All right, now that we've got that, let's go ahead and let's make our traffic light. So we're going to go add new. And let's call that traffic light. All right, super simple the way this is going to work. We can do this multiple ways. I just kind of demonstrated how to do it in the IDE. I'm going to actually bang this out via code. Let's go ahead and call this ID element. And sometimes the IDE is faster, sometimes it's faster to type. It's just really personal preference. Rectangle. And then we have a width, and let's go ahead and say 120, a height, and let's say 225. I'm just guessing here. Background color of this is going to be black. And then we want to set some anchors. So I'm going to say anchors, horizontal center, and the parent horizontal center is what we're going to be looking for. Let's do vertical center to vertical center. Now let's go ahead and add a column. And again, we could do all of this right in the designer if we really, really wanted to. Doesn't matter either way. And then we're going to anchors. Let's go ahead and center in parent. Now, because I'm in Linux, I tend to favor the typing rather than using the IDE, just because in the past, it has had a nasty habit of crashing on me at the wrong time, and then I end up losing some stuff. Now, it's gotten better, and I'm starting to trust it more. So, like, for example, I can stop typing and actually flip right into the designer. And you can see it automatically recognizes everything I need. And it even shows our little light component here. And we can actually drag this and drop it right in there. But then you see how it's a little weird. It just doesn't really seem to show. Frustrating. So then we could, of course, go in here, fill in some properties. We could have put in like a default width and height and things like that. So I'm going to say, let's call this red light. And I'll say width 100, height 100. And then we could set the state to on. And we could say the color off. Let's call this dark red. Color on. Let's call this red. Why not? And then we can just do the magic of copy and paste, grab this. Call this green light. Dark green is going to be color off, and I want lime green because it's really bright green for the color on. Very simple, very easy the way this works. Now, what we could do here is set some properties, or I should say some state properties here. And what am I really talking about? So our light has its individual states with their properties. We're going to do the same thing for our traffic light here. And again, We can do this in the designer if we want, and I will just so you can see the real-time changes. My preference, of course, is to type it all out just because this has had a nasty habit of crashing on me in the past here. So we have our base state, and now we have state 1. And let's call this stop. And you notice how it doesn't really help us out here in any of this stuff. So we'd have to hunt and peck through the interface, or we could just go into the code here and switch the individual things. There's no connections, no bindings, nothing like that. There's no backends. So this gets to be a little bit of the frustrating part with working with the IDE. Let's make another one. Let's call this Go. So now we have base state, stopped, and go. They all look very, very similar. We can go into the text editor and really change these around if we want to. We've got our stop and go state. So our stop state, we're going to stay property change. And let's go ahead and go target. And target's going to be the red light. And the state of the red light is now going to be on because the red light is now lit. And we can go in here. Property change, let's go green light is going to be off. And you can see down in this little visual representation it does it in pretty much real time. Actually really cool how that works. So we can grab some more property changes in here. Go here, just flip these around. Watch down here, you'll see these lights change. So I'm going to say this is the red light is now off. And then I'm going to turn that little green light on. Very cool. I haven't even hit save yet. Save, and it just works. So now I have a default state or a base state, a stop, and a go. Very, very cool. As much as I groan and complain about the editor, it's actually pretty advanced compared to what else is out there. I love it. All right, so flipping back to our main window, let's go ahead and add some stuff here. So I'm going to flip into the designer. As much as sometimes I groan and complain about the designer, it's actually really, really cool. We're just going to grab our traffic light, drag it, drop it. Make sure it's right there. Now you notice suddenly, magically, we have this little button here. And if we click it, invalid states M16, but it shows it down here. That's the frustrating thing that'll really screw you up. When in doubt, if you're in your main form or your main QML page, don't even try clicking this button because just nothing's going to happen. You'll have to go in there and try to manually add it in. You can do it. It's a bit advanced though. All right, so let's go ahead and add in quick controls. I want some buttons. First things first, let's get a row. There's our row in all of its glory. I want to put this right across the top here. Now, if you type and nothing happens, hit Control S. Sometimes it'll pop these up. Sometimes you have to go back to edit and then back to design, but usually that fixes that little bug. As much as I love Qt Creator, it does have some little bugs in it. All right, so let's go here. And let's look for our spacing. Let's give this a 10 spacing. Zoom in. I love how you can zoom in. That is so cool. All right, so let's just center this, and then I want this to be 25 from the top just because that's where I want it. Save. Let's go say, let's call this on, off, and toggle. And it doesn't matter if you do it in the designer or if you prefer to go into the code view and do it this way. Either way really works. So let's call this button on. We're going to say on clicked, and let's look at our traffic light here. Let's just grab that ID. Doesn't really matter what we called it, and we can say state equals go. And we just grab this. And then we can just, you guessed it, toggle the state. It's actually very simple at this point. So we can say if, and we want to traffic light state. One of the downsides of working with a string is you got to kind of figure out what you actually need, and sometimes you can get a little lost. And then we can actually just grab it from here and say, from here, it's very simple. It just works. So we can say on, off, and then toggle. Toggle's not working either. So what's going on here? Let's check this out here. So, all right, we have got our traffic light state on. See, this is what I mean by it's so easy to screw up. Look at our names here. Traffic light state on. If we go into the traffic light, we don't have a state on. We have stop and go. One of the little gotchas here. So now that we have the right state, everything should work. We're at our base state. We can say on, off, toggle. Why is off not working still? Again, the strings just kind of screwed us up here. Let's try that again. On, off, there we go. Now it's working. That's what I mean by those strings will just mess you up when you start working with state, especially if you start working on a complex application. So make sure you have a good naming convention in place. You're going to have the same problems I had. So just a quick recap. States in QML are ridiculously simple. The big takeaway here is always, always, always remember what you name your states, and states under the hood, really, it's just an array called states, and you have individual states. You set your property changes, which are your target, and then your state. It's very simple. So when you see property changes, think assignments. Remember how we talked about in C++ land how you're going to change and you're going to call the Q property under the hood? That's exactly what's going on here. We're saying red light property change state is going to equal on. So you could have written it something like this in your own mind. Simple, easy to use. You just got to watch out for a few little gotchas, and sometimes, yes, the IDE does betray you. I want to look a little bit deeper at the QML side of things. So we're going to build this little guy here. We're just going to reuse the light from the last video, and we're going to toggle these back and forth. But we're going to do it a little bit differently. We're going to use signals and slots the QML way to really monitor those objects. Let's close that. Just for reference, here's our light from the previous tutorial. We have an item. Inside we have a color property on, color property off, a rectangle, just going to have a radius the same size as the width. Try and make a circle. And then we have some states. We have state on, state off, which just has the color on, color off. Very, very simple to understand. In here, we are going to play around a little bit. So first things first, I'm going to have a row. And this row is going to have a width of, let's say, 300. And let's say height of 100. I'll go ahead and center this in the parent. And then we want to add some light. So I'm going to say light. And let's call this ID light 1. Its width will be 100. Its height will be 100. Its initial state will be off. And remember, because this is a string, you should probably go in here and double check you have the right state name. Otherwise, you're going to have a very bad time because it's just going to fail and it's not going to give you any sort of real output. It's not going to tell you why. So let's go ahead and grab this. Let's call that light 2. Let's set our spacing here quite a bit. Let's say spacing, set this to 100. So this should be just gigantic. Let's do this, and sure enough, there they are. So what we're going to do now is add some mouse areas so we can click these and turn them on or off. Let's go right here. And I'm going to say mouse area. on clicked, and now we're going to need some sort of JavaScript goodness here. And I'm going to make a function. We're going to call this toggle, and we're going to give it the parent. And in case you're confused, the parent is actually light1. And then on this one, same deal. The parent will be light2. So let's go up here and let's make our JavaScript goodness. Let's call this obj for object. And then the awesomeness that is JavaScript. I personally, when I started, I did not like JavaScript at all. I'm so used to C++, this was like, what is this nonsense? So anyways, I give a lot of flack to Qt for using strings on the state, but this is exactly why. When you're in JavaScript, it's so much easier just to use a state than it is to have some sort of custom object and figure out how to parse that object and what's going on under the hood. So we're going to say object state, and we're going to say off. So if it's on, we're going to turn it off. And if it's off, we are going to turn it on. So we're basically just toggling it. Let's go ahead and test that out. And assuming we didn't screw anything up, we can click and turn it on or off, and we can do that as fast or slow as we want. The next step is, I don't want this, and I don't want this. I want it to be one or the other, but not both. So we are going to make another function called enforce. And we're going to have a primary and a secondary. And these are just basic objects. And I want to know the primary state. And because it's just a string, console log just spits it right out with no problem. Say if the primary on, it's very easy to misspell and make some horrendous mistake. I've done this numerous times, so I've learned this lesson the hard way. Then I'm going to say I want the secondary otherwise we're going to say the secondary state on. Very, very simple. So how do we hook in this enforce? Well, we could do it here and then say, hey, you know, set the other one, or we could have done it up in this JavaScript. But really what I want to focus on is how do we get the signals and slots out of the state machine via QML? This is actually a lot easier than it looks. So we're going to go here, and you can just hit Control Space on the keyboard, and it brings up pretty much everything. Now you notice some of these start with on, and if you're familiar with QML, you know those are signals. So let's just go ahead and hit on, and then Control Space, and it automatically filters them. And we can say state changed. Very, very simple. And we can enforce. So our primary is going to be light1. Our secondary is going to be light2. And we need to flip these around for the other light. So again, multiple ways of doing this. You could have done it all one nice, neat little JavaScript in the onClick, but I wanted to monitor the state of the state machine. All right. Assuming we didn't misspell anything, like if we have some horrible misspelling like this, we'll have a bad time. If we, gave it the wrong ID, we'll have a bad time. Assuming everything lines up, this should just work. All right, so there's one, and bang. Very, very simple. Very, very easy. Now, if you wanted to, at the very start of this, enforce the state of one of these, what we could do is go right here and say component, and we want onCompleted, and we can say light1 state equals on, and then if we wanted to, we can enforce it. We don't really need to because both of them are going to be off, but we can set the individual properties. Becomes very, very simple at this point. Ta-da! So major takeaway here is hooking into signals and slots is ridiculously simple. You can also just do it however you want. There's really no rules. Everything's up for grabs. let's go back a minute and take a look at the QHistoryState. I said we were going to talk about this, and I wanted to make it super simple. So now that you understand how the state machine framework works in C++ and QML, you understand that the QStateHistory is pretty much just holding a pointer. That's really all there is to it. Let's take a look at a previous project. I think this was number 5. And all it was is you had these states and you could step through them and then step back. But we want to change this. So we're going to add 2 buttons here. So we're going to add a button here and a button here. Let's go ahead and scale this out just a little bit. Let's call this bookmark and jump. So as we navigate through this, we're going to be able to bookmark something, and then we can just say, you know what, I don't want to navigate. I want to jump right back to where I was. And we're going to demonstrate this. So let's right click, go to slot, clicked, and then right click, go to slot, and then clicked. All right, jump up here, and you guessed it, we need to add an include. So we are going to include QHistoryState. Now, QHistoryState's a little bit different than what you're thinking. You may be thinking, hey, I want, all these really cool, fancy things. No, you don't get any of them. I'm sorry. It's really very simplistic. So I'm going to say QHistoryState mhistory, and we're just going to hold a pointer. We're going to switch over to our code, go all the way to the top here before we create any states. And I'm going to say mhistory equal new QHistoryState. And I should note, you can add as many of these as you want, but they will start trampling over each other if you forget to delete them. So for example, if you were to make a bookmark, not delete it, and make another bookmark, it's going to use its best guess internally to try and figure out which one you actually want, and then, well, bad things happen. Notice how our history, we're saying, is a new history state on our root. And in this video, or I should say the previous example we used it for the video, this was the container for all of our other states. Now we're going to say root, add transition, and we want the UI. And again, if you're getting this problem where it's just not doing it, you can save, give it a build, and then it should appear in that list. So I'm going to say, all right, so add transition, we are going to add our jump button. So when the button is clicked, maybe, there we go. When it's clicked, then we want to navigate to our mhistory. Very, very similar design. So if we look at the code that we've already had in here, so we have our transitions, and when a button is clicked, we go to a state. So all we're really saying here is when this jump button is clicked, we're going to jump to the history. And the history is simply going to point somewhere else. It's almost like, think of it like a bookmark. All right, now that we've got that, let's go down to our buttons here. Again, I do not trust Qt's automatic signals and slot connections based off their naming convention. It has betrayed me in the past, so I'm just going to put a QInfo in there. And then for our bookmark, I'm going to say, if not mcurrent, then we're going to go ahead and return. And then I'm going to say mhistory, and we're going to set the default state. And we're going to set it to whatever we're currently on here. It's very, very simple. I wanted to save this till dead last. That way you got kind of an end-to-end view of the state machine framework before we try to really explain this. So just to recap, we have a QHistoryState. We have a pointer here. At the very beginning, we're saying make our mhistory a child of our root. And our root is, of course, our main container. And we're going to say root add transition. the jump button to whatever the history is pointing to. And then in our two buttons, we've got jump, which we really have nothing in there. We just have that so this doesn't automatically get removed. We're going to have the bookmark clicked. We're going to say the history, set the default state to whatever we're currently on. Let's try this, see what it looks like. All right, so let's do this. We're on state 1. I'm going to bookmark that, jump over a few, and then we're going to jump, and it's going to go right back to state 1. And we could go to like state 4, bookmark that, navigate somewhere, I don't care where, and then jump right back to where we were on state 4. This is actually very, very cool when you think about it. So now you can actually implement things in your code such as undo, redo, and things of that nature. You can have virtually infinite number of queue history states. The problem, of course, is if you have a bunch of these, you have to figure out which one you're trying to jump to, and that's where things can get a little bit confusing.